I suspect Joe Morgan is probably breathing a sigh of relief today. It remains problematic for Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens ever making it to the Hall of Fame, after Morgan's impassioned letter to the Baseball Writers Association back in November, in which he said players who failed drug tests or were mentioned in the Mitchell report were cheaters who should not be allowed in the Hall of Fame. It seemed there was more backlash from my brethren than bravos. Who is Joe Morgan to tell me how to vote? So many of them wrote. And then when Morgan said the Hall of Fame was special and revered, and that many of his fellow Hall of Famers have said they will not return to Cooperstown for inductions of cheaters, you heard the same tired diatribes about the Hall of Fame being filled with reprobates. It's hard to say what effect, if any, Morgan's letter had on the electorate, but it would appear the hardliners against them remain firm. Their gains -3% each were minimal, especially compared to last year when Clemens went from 45% to 54.1% and Bonds from 44 to 53.8. As one of the hardliners who applauded Morgan stating his case against cheaters, I admit to feeling it probably came too late, that the writers have probably already voted in cheaters, but at least Mike Piazza, Jeff Bagwell and Ivan Rodriguez never tested positive for anything and were not among the 89 names in the Mitchell report, and for that, writers could feel justified voting for them. By contrast, Bonds was mentioned 103 times in the Mitchell report and Clemens 82. Another issue that was thought to possibly have a bearing on Bonds and Clemens making more big gains this year was the election of Bud Selig to the Hall last year by the Veterans Committee. If the guy who presided over the steroids era and looked the other way when Mark McGwire and Sammy Sosa led the barrage on the home run records is in, how can you now deny Bonds and Clemens? The argument went, but if you're going to condemn Selig for ignoring the looming steroids crisis, as everyone else, writers included, did, does he get no credit for acting decisively, as he did, in cleaning up the game? It took a public flogging from Congress, but it was Selig who dragged players' union leaders Donald Fair and Gene Norza kicking and screaming back to the bargaining table to ultimately get the strongest drug testing program in professional sports, Kevork Johnsazian/AP, and besides, the writers didn't elect Selig, nor did they elect the first commissioner, Kennesaw Mountain Landis, whose greatest claim to fame, or rather infamy, in retrospect was to keep players of color out of the game to the day he died, or Tom Yawkey, the Red Sox owner who saw to it his team would hold the dubious distinction of last to integrate. I agree with Morgan that the Hall of Fame is the highest honor in baseball and, for all their inflated, artificial records, cheaters like Bonds and Clemens should not be rewarded. Anybody who thinks they didn't cheat because they never tested positive is just being naive. And the recurring argument that Bonds in particular was already a Hall of Famer before he started cheating is just ridiculous. It's like saying Shoeless Joe Jackson was already a Hall of Famer before he chose to be part of a conspiracy to fix the 1919 World Series. Call me old-fashioned, but I still take seriously the character/integrity clause in the Hall of Fame ballot. It's also why I vote every year for Fred McGriff, who is probably the biggest victim of all of the steroids cheats. Were it not for Bonds, Sosa, McGwire, Alex Rodriguez, Rafael Palmeiro et al., McGriff's 493 homers, 1,550 RBI, .886 OPS would likely be regarded as Hall of Fame caliber. Instead, his numbers have been dwarfed and he's languishing at 23% with time running out. It's very unfortunate for Fred, with players with clouds of suspicion having passed him on the list, said Chipper Jones after his election as the leading vote-getter with 92.2%. Rusty Kennedy/AP, it remains to be seen, with 4 more years of eligibility, if Bonds and Clemens will be able to make up the nearly 20% needed for election. Good news for them apparently is that more than 95% of the new voters coming on the electorate in recent years are said to have been voting for them, and there are approximately 20 new voters every year. But in a year where the sentiment for them going to the Hall seemed to be gaining, they stalled. I am reminded what George Brett, Tom Seaver and Johnny Bench used to tell me every year at the July inductions at Cooperstown. You guys keep sending us class acts. We did it again this year with Chipper, Jim Thome, Vlad Guerrero, and Trevor Hoffman. Hopefully, the integrity/character clause will prevail for another